The plastic fork clattered to the floor of the bustling food court as 3-year-old Marcus began turning blue. His tiny hands clawed at his throat while his father frantically shook him, panic flooding his voice as he screamed for help. Around them, dozens of shoppers froze in horror, phones raised to record the unfolding tragedy rather than assist. The child's lips darkened from pink to purple as precious seconds ticked away. From across the crowded space, a woman in a faded custodial uniform dropped her mop bucket and ran. Maria Santos had been invisible to these people for 15 years, just another face among the cleaning staff who emptied their trash and wiped their tables. But as she knelt beside the choking boy, something in her movements made the crowd step back instinctively. Her hands moved with surgical precision, tilting the child's head, checking his airway, positioning her fingers with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. The father, a man in an expensive suit with perfectly styled silver hair, looked down at her with desperate hope mixed with skepticism. Who was this cleaning woman who dared to touch his son when trained paramedics hadn't yet arrived? What he didn't know was that those weathered hands had once held the power of life and death in the most prestigious hospital in the city. What would you do if the person you dismissed as invisible turned out to be your only hope? Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as ordinary encounters with extraordinary people. Maria Santos lived in a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat in the city's forgotten district, where sirens wailed through thin walls and the scent of industrial detergent masked deeper urban decay. At 52, she had the kind of face that people look through rather than at. Weathered brown skin marked by years of night shifts and double overtime. Graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that never varied. Her neighbors in the building knew her as the quiet woman in 4B, who left for work before dawn and returned after sunset, carrying grocery bags filled with generic brands and day-old bread from the discount bakery. She moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision. Instant coffee in a chipped mug, plain oatmeal sweetened with honey packets, saved from restaurants. A quick glance at bills she couldn't quite afford to pay on time. Her work uniform hung pressed and ready, the same navy blue dress with Santos embroidered above the pocket that she'd worn for 15 years at Westfield Medical Center. Not as a doctor, as the janitor who mopped the halls where she once saved lives. The other custodial staff had long ago stopped asking about her past, accepting her silence as natural shyness, rather than protective armor around wounds that never quite healed. Maria preferred it that way, invisible among people who saw only the surface, who couldn't imagine that the woman emptying their wastebaskets had once commanded operating rooms and trained residents in procedures they'd never master. When her supervisor assigned her to the afternoon shift in the children's wing, she'd requested a transfer without explanation. Being around sick children was a special kind of torture for someone whose life had been destroyed by failing to save the one child who mattered most. The medical center's cafeteria and food court had become her regular assignment, a place where she could work in relative anonymity, wiping tables and restocking napkin dispensers while families celebrated small victories and mourned devastating losses just feet away. She'd learned to tune out conversations about treatment plans and surgical procedures, though sometimes a medical term would catch her attention and send her spiraling back to a time when those words had been her daily language, when she'd spoken them with authority rather than overhearing them as an outsider looking in. 15 years earlier, Dr. Maria Santos had been the youngest chief of pediatric surgery in the history of Metro General Hospital, a prodigy whose innovative techniques had revolutionized treatment for congenital heart defects in infants. At 37, she'd already published groundbreaking research on minimally invasive cardiac procedures, her work saving hundreds of tiny lives across the country as other surgeons adopted her methods. The medical journals featured her regularly, and colleagues spoke her name with reverence, calling her the miracle worker who could repair hearts so small they seemed impossibly fragile. Her own heart had been equally invested in her work. Every successful surgery a validation of the calling she'd felt since childhood. watching her grandmother struggle with a weak heart that doctors dismissed as unfixable because she was poor and brown and spoke broken English. Maria had promised herself she would become the doctor her grandmother needed, the one who saw humanity first and bank accounts second. That promise had driven her through medical school on scholarships and student loans, through residency programs where she was often the only woman and certainly the only Latina, through years of proving herself with twice the skill and 10 times the determination of her male counterparts. She'd married David Santos, a fellow physician who understood the demands of her profession, and together they'd built a life centered around healing others while planning for children of their own someday when the pace slowed down. But the pace never slowed, and when Maria finally became pregnant at 39, she'd thrown herself into preparing for the dual role of mother and surgeon with characteristic intensity. She'd read every book, attended every class, planned every detail of how she would balance her career with raising a child who would grow up knowing that helping others was the highest calling. The pregnancy had been complicated from the beginning. High blood pressure and early contractions that forced her to step back from surgery during her final trimester. A decision that gnawed at her as she watched other doctors handle cases she could have managed better. When baby Elena was born 6 weeks premature with a complex heart defect that Maria recognized immediately, the irony was devastating. The woman who had saved hundreds of children's hearts couldn't save her own daughter's. The surgery that should have been routine, the type Maria had performed countless times, became a nightmare when Elena's tiny body rejected the repair, when complications cascaded faster than any team could manage, when all of Maria's knowledge and skill proved helpless against the cruel randomness of fate. Elena lived for 18 days, long enough for Maria to memorize every perfect finger and toe, long enough to whisper promises of love and protection that she couldn't keep, long enough for Maria to understand that all her professional victories meant nothing compared to this one devastating loss. The investigation that followed Elena's death was thorough and ultimately exonerated Maria of any malpractice, but the damage to her psyche was irreparable. She'd second-guessed every decision, replayed every moment of the surgery, convinced herself that someone else might have saved Elena where she had failed. The medical community rallied around her, colleagues offering support and understanding, but their sympathy felt like pity to a woman who had always prided herself on competence and control. David had tried to help her heal, suggesting grief counseling and time away from the hospital. But Maria had retreated into herself, unable to explain how the hands that had once moved with such confidence now trembled when she held a scalpel. 6 months after Elena's death, during what should have been a routine appendectomy on a 7-year-old boy, Maria froze. The incision was made, the appendix clearly visible, but her hands wouldn't move. She stood at the operating table for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the child's open abdomen while her surgical team waited for instructions that never came. The attending physician had to complete the procedure while Maria was escorted from the room, her career effectively ending in that moment of paralysis. The hospital offered her a leave of absence, professional counseling, alternative positions that would keep her in medicine without the pressure of surgery. But Maria knew she was finished. The confidence she'd built over decades had evaporated, replaced by a terror of making life or death decisions that might result in another child's death on her watch. She'd resigned quietly, refusing interviews or explanations, and disappeared from the medical world that had once celebrated her innovations. David had begged her to reconsider, to fight for the career she'd worked so hard to build. But Maria was already planning her exile from the profession that had given her everything and then taken it all away. The divorce papers had been inevitable, not because David stopped loving her, but because Maria could no longer love herself. And the constant reminders of their shared dreams were unbearable. She'd moved out of their suburban home with its carefully planned nursery and into the small apartment where she could grieve in private, where no one expected her to be anything more than another struggling single woman trying to make ends meet on minimum wage. The Westfield Medical Center's food court buzzed with the usual afternoon energy when Maria arrived for her shift that day. Families grabbing quick meals between appointments, medical staff stealing moments of normalcy amid their demanding schedules. She'd been cleaning tables for 20 minutes when she noticed the well-dressed man sitting alone with a small boy, their expensive clothes and confident demeanor marking them as part of the hospital's elite patient family, people accustomed to private rooms and personal attention from department heads. The man was typing furiously on his phone while the child played with his food, a typical scene of busy parenting that Maria had witnessed countless times before. She was wiping down tables 3 rows away when the boy started coughing, then choking, his small face contorting in distress as his father looked up from his phone with dawning horror. In that moment, every instinct Maria had suppressed for 15 years came flooding back. She didn't think about her fears or her failures or the child she couldn't save. She only saw a 3-year-old boy who needed help, and her body responded with muscle memory stronger than doubt. Maria reached the table in seconds, her trained eyes immediately assessing the situation as the father stood helplessly, shaking his son and calling his name. The child's lips were already turning blue, indicating a complete airway obstruction that would result in brain damage within minutes if not resolved immediately. Without hesitation, Maria positioned herself behind the boy's chair, tilted his head forward, and delivered 5 precise back blows between his shoulder blades, each strike calculated to dislodge the obstruction without causing additional injury. When the back blows failed to clear the airway, she turned the child to face her and began chest thrusts, her fingers positioned exactly 2 finger widths below the nipple line, pressing firmly and rhythmically while monitoring his color and consciousness level. The father watched in amazement as this cleaning woman demonstrated knowledge and skill that surpassed most of the medical professionals he'd encountered, her movements confident and precise despite the high-stakes pressure of the situation. After 30 seconds of chest thrusts, Maria tilted the boy's head back slightly and swept his mouth with her finger, dislodging a piece of chicken that had been blocking his trachea completely. The child gasped, then began crying loudly, the most beautiful sound his father had ever heard, and Maria held him gently while his breathing normalized and his color returned to healthy pink. She checked his pulse, examined his throat for any remaining obstruction, and spoke to him in soothing Spanish while his father stood frozen in gratitude and confusion. The entire rescue had taken less than 2 minutes, but those minutes had revealed everything about who Maria Santos really was beneath the uniform and the silence. As the child's breathing stabilized and his father swept him into a desperate embrace, Maria stepped back quietly, hoping to return to her cleaning duties before attracting more attention. But the man's eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made retreat impossible. She recognized the look of someone trying to reconcile what they'd witnessed with their expectations. The cognitive dissonance of watching a janitor demonstrate medical expertise that suggested extensive training and experience. Around them, the food court crowd began to disperse, their phones already uploading videos of the dramatic rescue to social media. But the father seemed oblivious to everything except the woman who had saved his son's life. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion and confusion. "I mean, what you just did, that wasn't basic first aid. You moved like a doctor." Maria's hands trembled as she picked up her cleaning supplies, the adrenaline of the emergency beginning to fade and leave behind the familiar weight of her secret identity. "I just helped a child who was choking," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Anyone would have done the same. But the man wasn't satisfied with her deflection. He introduced himself as Senator Richard Blackwood, a name Maria recognized from news coverage of healthcare legislation and medical research funding, though she didn't reveal her familiarity with his political career. Senator Blackwood's son, Marcus, had been visiting the medical center for a routine consultation about a minor heart murmur. Nothing serious. But the irony wasn't lost on Maria that she'd saved the child of a man whose policies had impacted the very hospital where she'd once worked. As Marcus clung to his father and babbled about the nice lady who helped him breathe, Senator Blackwood pressed Maria for more information about her background, clearly sensing that her expertise went far beyond custodial training. His gratitude was genuine, but there was also something calculating in his expression. The look of a politician who recognized opportunity when it presented itself. Maria had encountered enough powerful people during her medical career to understand that Senator Blackwood's interest went beyond simple thanks, that he was already considering how this encounter might be leveraged for his own purposes. She'd seen too many politicians use personal stories to advance their agendas, and she had no interest in becoming anyone's symbol or cause. But as she tried to excuse herself and return to work, Senator Blackwood made a request that stopped her cold. "I'd like to do something to thank you," he said, pulling out his phone. "A reward, recognition, maybe some media coverage about everyday heroes. This kind of story inspires people." The thought of media attention sent ice through Maria's veins. The prospect of reporters digging into her background and discovering her past life as Dr. Maria Santos, the pediatric surgeon who'd left medicine under mysterious circumstances. She declined firmly, insisting that she'd simply done what anyone would do, but Senator Blackwood's persistence suggested he wasn't accustomed to people refusing his offers of publicity and reward. 3 days later, Maria arrived at work to find her supervisor waiting with an unusual expression of concern and confusion. Someone had called the hospital administration asking questions about Maria Santos, specifically about her qualifications and background, and the inquiry had come from Senator Blackwood's office. The supervisor, a kind woman named Janet, who had always treated Maria with respect despite never prying into her past, seemed torn between protecting her employees' privacy and satisfying the demands of such a prominent political figure. "Maria, I don't know what happened the other day, but this senator seems very interested in you," Janet said carefully. "He's asking about your training, your experience, whether you have any medical background. I told him we don't discuss employee information, but he seemed to think you might be qualified for some kind of special recognition program he's developing." Maria's heart sank as she realized that her attempt to remain invisible had failed spectacularly. Senator Blackwood had clearly been investigating her since the incident, probably having his staff research anyone named Maria Santos who worked at Westfield Medical Center, and it was only a matter of time before they connected her to Dr. Maria Santos, the pediatric surgeon who had disappeared from Metro General 15 years earlier. The medical community was smaller than most people realized, and her former colleagues would remember her sudden departure, her refusal to explain her reasons for leaving, the whispered speculation about what had happened to the brilliant young surgeon who had simply vanished from professional life. She tried to reassure Janet that the senator's interest was misplaced, that she was simply a custodial worker who had learned basic first aid through experience. But her supervisor's expression suggested she was beginning to connect dots of her own. Janet had always noticed things about Maria that seemed inconsistent with her job title. The way she sometimes corrected medical terminology she overheard in conversations, her familiarity with hospital procedures and protocols, her instinctive knowledge of which areas were most critical to keep sterile. These observations had never seemed important before, but in light of Senator Blackwood's inquiries, they painted a picture of someone with far more medical knowledge than a janitor should possess. "Maria, if there's something you want to tell me about your background, I want you to know that I respect your privacy," Janet said gently. "But if this senator keeps pushing, and if he has the kind of influence he seems to have, it might be better if we get ahead of whatever story he's chasing." The weight of 15 years of carefully constructed invisibility pressed down on Maria as she realized that her secret was about to be exposed, whether she cooperated or not. She could continue denying her medical background and hope that Senator Blackwood would lose interest, but politicians like him rarely abandon stories that might serve their purposes, especially stories about heroic everyday citizens who embodied the values they claimed to champion. That evening, Maria sat in her small apartment, holding a photograph she hadn't looked at in years. A picture of herself in surgical scrubs, holding baby Elena during one of their precious few moments together. The infant's tiny face was peaceful in sleep, unaware that her time was measured in days rather than decades, and Maria's expression radiated the fierce love and determination that had defined her final weeks as a mother. Next to the photograph lay Elena's hospital bracelet, so small it could barely encircle Maria's thumb, a reminder of dreams that had died with the daughter she couldn't save. For 15 years, she'd carried the weight of that failure in silence, convinced that her inability to save Elena disqualified her from ever practicing medicine again, that her hands were cursed rather than gifted. But the memory of little Marcus gasping for air, of his father's desperate gratitude, of the way her training had taken over despite her fears, suggested that perhaps her exile from medicine had been self-imposed rather than justified. She'd saved that child without hesitation, without the paralysis that had ended her surgical career, and the success felt both foreign and familiar, like remembering a language she'd tried to forget. The knock on her door came at exactly 8 o'clock, and Maria wasn't surprised to find Senator Blackwood standing in the hallway of her shabby apartment building, his expensive suit and confident bearing incongruous among the faded wallpaper and flickering fluorescent lights. He'd clearly used his resources to track down her address, another demonstration of the power and persistence that had made him successful in politics. "Dr. Santos," he said quietly, and the use of her former title hit her like a physical blow. "May I come in? I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Maria's hands shook as she opened the door wider, knowing that her carefully constructed life of anonymity was about to crumble. Senator Blackwood entered her modest apartment and looked around without judgment, his focus entirely on the woman whose secret he'd uncovered, rather than her humble circumstances. He'd done his research thoroughly, she realized, probably knowing more about her past than some of her former colleagues. "I know who you were," he said gently, settling into the single chair at her small kitchen table. "Dr. Maria Santos, Chief of Pediatric Surgery at Metro General, one of the most innovative heart surgeons of your generation. I also know you disappeared from medicine 15 years ago, and no one seems to know why." Maria remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself protectively as she waited for the confrontation she'd dreaded for so long. But Senator Blackwood's tone wasn't accusatory or demanding. Instead, he spoke with the careful respect of someone who understood that he was treading on sacred ground. "What I don't understand is why someone with your skills and training is working as a janitor instead of saving lives in an operating room," he continued. "And after what I witnessed 3 days ago, after watching you save my son's life with expertise that most doctors couldn't match, I need to know what happened." Maria stared out her small window at the city lights below, each bright point a life continuing despite the darkness around it, and finally found the courage to speak the truth she'd hidden for 15 years. "I lost a child," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter Elena. She was born with a heart defect, and I couldn't save her. After that, I couldn't trust myself to make life or death decisions about other people's children." Senator Blackwood listened in silence as Maria told him about Elena's brief life and devastating death, about the moment in the operating room when her confidence shattered, about the years of exile she'd imposed on herself as penance for her perceived failure. She expected him to offer platitudes about healing and moving forward, the kind of empty reassurance that well-meaning people had given her when she'd first lost Elena. Instead, he asked the question that no one had ever posed directly. "Do you think Elena would want you to spend the rest of your life hiding from the gift that could save other children?" The question hit Maria like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the possibility that her long exile might have been motivated more by self-pity than genuine inability to practice medicine. She'd told herself for years that stepping away from surgery was the responsible choice, that she was protecting future patients from her compromised judgment, but Senator Blackwood's words suggested a different interpretation of her actions. "I failed her," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face for the first time in years. "I was supposed to be the best, and I couldn't save my own daughter." "You didn't fail her," Senator Blackwood replied firmly. "You gave her 18 days of life that she wouldn't have had without your expertise keeping her alive. And in the 15 years since then, how many children have died who might have lived if the brilliant Dr. Maria Santos had been in the operating room instead of hiding in a custodial closet?" His words were harsh but not cruel, spoken with the directness of someone who understood that sometimes truth required brutal honesty. "My son is alive tonight because you didn't let fear override your training when he needed help. That tells me that whatever broke inside you 15 years ago might not be as permanent as you've convinced yourself." Maria sank into the chair across from him, exhausted by years of carrying grief and guilt that had perhaps been unnecessary. "Even if that's true, I can't just go back to surgery after 15 years away from medicine. My credentials have lapsed, my skills are rusty, and no hospital would take the risk of hiring someone with my history." Senator Blackwood smiled for the first time since entering her apartment, the expression of a man who had built his career on solving seemingly impossible problems. "Dr. Santos, I chair the Senate Subcommittee on Healthcare and Medical Research. I think I might be able to help with those obstacles, if you're willing to try." In the weeks that followed, Maria found herself caught between terror and hope as Senator Blackwood used his considerable influence to create a pathway back to medicine that seemed impossible yet increasingly real. He'd connected her with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the current chief of pediatric surgery at Children's Memorial Hospital, who remembered Maria's groundbreaking research and had wondered for years what had happened to the colleague she'd admired. Chen offered something Maria had never dared imagine, a chance to return to medicine gradually, starting with consultation work and research rather than jumping back into surgery, with the option to rebuild her skills and confidence at her own pace. The hospital's administration, impressed by Senator Blackwood's endorsement and intrigued by the story of Dr. Santos's heroic rescue, agreed to create a special fellowship position that would allow Maria to work alongside current surgeons while updating her knowledge of new techniques and technologies. It wasn't charity, Dr. Chen insisted, but recognition that Maria's experience and insights could benefit the entire department, even as she relearned aspects of medicine that had evolved during her absence. The credentialing process was complex, requiring Maria to complete competency evaluations, attend training sessions, and work under supervision until she demonstrated that her skills met current standards. But for the first time in 15 years, Maria felt a spark of the passion that had originally drawn her to medicine, the sense of purpose that came from using her abilities to help others rather than hiding from them in shame. Senator Blackwood had also suggested another role for Maria, one that combined her medical expertise with his political platform, serving as a consultant on healthcare policy, helping him understand how legislation affected doctors and patients at the ground level. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that a custodial worker had become his most valuable advisor on medical issues, her perspective shaped by years of observing healthcare from both the inside and the margins. 3 months after that fateful day in the food court, Dr. Maria Santos walked through the halls of Children's Memorial Hospital wearing scrubs instead of a uniform, her ID badge identifying her as a consulting surgeon rather than custodial staff. The transformation felt surreal, like awakening from a long dream of invisibility to find herself substantial and useful once again. But the most meaningful moment came when she was introduced to her first patient consultation, a 6-month-old girl with a complex heart defect similar to Elena's, whose parents looked at Maria with the same desperate hope she remembered from her own days as a mother seeking miracles. As Maria examined the tiny patient and discussed treatment options with the family, she felt Elena's presence like a blessing rather than a curse, her daughter's brief life giving meaning to the work of saving other children. The hands that had once trembled with doubt moved with renewed confidence, guided by experience and tempered by loss, but no longer paralyzed by fear. Senator Blackwood had been right about the gift that couldn't be wasted, about the children who needed Dr. Maria Santos more than she needed to punish herself for being human in the face of tragedy. Sometimes the greatest healing comes not from forgetting our wounds, but from learning to transform them into wisdom that serves others.